Hey guys, so I thought I'd do a video for you on the fried liver attack. Now this is a really useful weapon to have up your sleeve. It works very well at the beginner and improving kind of levels. You need to know particularly how to defend against it, and you need to know, well, it's very useful to know how to use it when you're playing with the white pieces. So I'm going to take you through the opening moves. Now a lot of people kind of fall into this idea that thinking that the fried liver attack is just about having like a bishop on c4 and a knight here, both looking at the pawn on f7. But that's not quite it. The fried liver is actually quite a specific sequence. So I've got a game up that I played today. I've started trying to. I've never really played the fried liver, so I'm trying it out and seeing how the games go. So playing today against a player rated not far off 1500, so good standard of player. And we have e4 and e5, the king's pawn opening, knight to f3 and knight to c6. We've seen that so many times before. And now I might play the Scotch, or you might see the Ruy Lopez, or bishop to c4, which would be the Italian, maybe even knight coming out to c3. But this comes from the Italian game. Very solid, very useful opening. You might also bring out the bishop on move 2 and the knight on move 3. Now what you're looking for is this 3-knight setup, okay, where black now brings out his king's knight to f6, and of course that then blocks this square from the queen. So the queen is no longer defending the g5 square, and that's good because we haven't moved the d-pawn yet. So your bishop is not protecting that square either, but because the knight has moved to f6, it means that your knight can now come into g5. And it's going to be very difficult for black to defend this square. Now, if you are black, if you are playing with the black pieces and you see this move, so let's just flip the board, all right? So let's play through it from black, e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, very normal. Bishop comes out, and if you then play f6, this is playable, and the knight comes in, there's only one thing you can do. There's only one move, and it's always d5. All right? Anything else is going to cause you a lot of trouble. So we'll flip the board again. Okay, so now black plays d5. Now white captures on d5 with the pawn. So you are now attacking this knight on c6, and so black needs to do something about it. Taking the knight away is a possibility. Knight to a5 is a pretty good continuation from here, but very often what you will see is knight takes pawn on d5, and we are very much now in the fried liver territory with the next move, and this is the signature move of the fried liver. Knight takes f7, and it seems as though it's sacrificing a piece, but in actual fact this now can cause many problems for black. So clearly you've come in with, you've captured a pawn, and you've got a fork against the queen and the rook. The only way for black not to lose significant material is to capture with the king, and that's what you'll see pretty much every time. And now what you do is, as white, you bring your queen out to f3 with check, and also hitting this knight a second time. So you are going to recover the piece that you've just sacked. From this point, there are a few moves. King up to e6 is good, and that's probably what you'll see at the higher level. According to the computer, this move is best, and I've played this twice already today. So one good thing about having the fried liver in your repertoire is that you will actually get to pull it out quite often. Right? So I've played this twice today, and both times my opponent has played this move, which the engine says is actually the best. What you do now is clearly you capture the knight. You could also capture it with the queen, but I think this comes with check. And now the king obviously can't really step away from the queen. It's defended by a pawn. But let me show you how this particular game panned out. So the king moved across. So let's just evaluate the board now. Okay, so we've got a situation where both sides have got 1, 2, 3 minor pieces. Okay, both of black's bishops are still in the starting blocks, as well as the rooks. The king cannot castle, and he has an isolated pawn. All right, compared to white's situation, all the pawns, all the remaining 7 pawns are still at home. 2 minor pieces still to develop also, but white is very close to being able to castle. Okay, so it's clearly, the board is clearly in white's favour, and I think that the engine actually has white up about 3 points by this point. So now what you need to do is simplify, maybe open up the centre, seeing as the king's stuck in there. You're going to have an advantage. You're going to get at least 1 rook into the game pretty quickly. Okay, so here's how the game goes. So I started by swapping off the queens, and now black still has these 3 pawn islands, so not ideal at all, and a king stuck in the middle of the board. I push d3 to get my dark square bishop out. Bishop comes out, and we swap off bishops. I figure getting to an endgame is only going to serve me. And now I castle to protect c2 from the knight. Rook comes across attacking g2, I'm not bothered, push g3, pawn comes down, pawn kicks the bishop, and bishop now decides to swap itself off for a knight. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, knights, if you're down to 1 minor piece in the endgame, sometimes a knight can be very, very useful. Now we have a fork on the king and the bishop, and we swap off the knight and the bishop. Okay, so we're very quickly now in an ending. Let's just move 20 now. So now I centralise my rook, which makes sense. It's putting it on the semi-open file, where the only file where I don't have a pawn. Okay, and also it's lining up with black's king. So an idea next could be f4, which the pawn can't take because it's pinned. And if it was to advance, then I can just capture with a rook. So we have c5 and now f4, and the king evades. Now I bring my rook up, rook across, double up my rooks, rook to g6. Now I lift my rook just so that it's defending these pawns. It doesn't need to be on the back rank. Might as well do a job there. Okay, rook comes in, king starts to come closer, and now we swap off some pieces. I decide not to trade off the second rook. And now this move is interesting because now I'm hitting this pawn, and the only way for black to defend that pawn would be to push f4. So he can't defend both pawns with the rook. If he pushes f4, which is what he did in the game, then I just snatch that one as well. And now I've got a pawn majority on both sides of the board. I've got 4 against 3 and I've got 2 against 1. So this should now be a formality. Throw in a check, start to bring my king in closer, and again. And now we swap off the rooks. And how is black going to stop this pawn from getting up the other end of the board? And if he does, he's going to have to block it with his king, and then I can simply bring up my pawns and use my pawn majority now on the king side. So it's over fairly quickly. Now my pawn starts to rush. I've calculated that black cannot get his pawn queened before I do, and so now this is very important actually. This is a really, really good end game lesson for you. When you have a situation like this and your opponent has a pawn that is 1 step away from castling, that is protected by a king, there is a very specific method and approach that you have to use in order to win that pawn. Okay. Now, interestingly, your queen on her own cannot win the pawn. That king can just keep circling round the pawn as long as it wants. So you have to bring in your king. You have to get your king adjacent to this pawn in order to be able to capture it. Now, so the thing to remember in this is that when your opponent puts their king in front of their pawn, you can move your king in, right? When your opponent has his king out on any of these other squares, you have to keep delivering check until, the king goes back in front of the pawn, and when that happens, you're bringing in your king. So watch how this works. Okay, so pawn goes to there, and now I realise that we're in this pattern. So king comes in because the king is in front of the pawn. King moves, check. King goes back. My king takes a step forwards, right? There we go, and now this is very simple checkmate, right? So there you go. The fried liver attack. We'll go through it again very quickly. Comes from the Italian game, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Then bishop to c4 is the Italian. Now, if you see this, then you can go for the fried liver. Knight to g5. The only appropriate response, the only real way to defend f7 is to play d5, at which point you capture with the pawn. Now, if knight captures, knight takes pawn, king comes out, you win back your knight, and you're away. There are going to be a bunch of sidelines, but I'm going to keep studying this. I'm still building up my notes on my own theory on this opening. But I think it's definitely worth knowing. It's particularly worth knowing how to defend against, particularly with that d5 pawn push. There are also lots of great videos on this on YouTube as well, so I'll link to a few. I think Ben Feingold has done a very good one, very in-depth one. So hope that's been useful for you. Little useful endgame lesson in there as well. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed to Chess Bootcamp, please do subscribe so that you don't miss any of the content that I put out. It's all about helping players to get to the 1000 level and beyond. Okay, so thank you again for watching. I'll see you soon.